Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. In 1990, the first web server went live at CERN, the Nuclear and Particle Physics Research Center near Geneva in Switzerland. The idea was to organize and preserve the ever-growing amount of information at CERN, text-based information, that is. It was Tim Berners-Lee who came up with the concept and created the Hypertext Markup Language, or HTML, and the rest is, as they say, history. 35 years on, it's difficult to imagine a world without web services and web applications in all its different forms and shapes. Anyone who's ever written code for a web app or a website using HTML knows that the basic concept is that of a document. And the result, that is the thing we can see on the screen, is referred to as a page. The reason for using pages and documents as metaphors for describing web content has its roots, of course, in the origins of the web, and early websites really did look like pages from printed documents or books. But in the last 30-odd years or so, things have moved on considerably. First of all, pages and documents are delivered to a plethora of different devices and screens. Then they are no longer just displaying static text with the occasional image being thrown in here and there. Nowadays we talk about web applications rather than websites. And what we call a web page or a web document usually consists of a set of different components, sometimes a rather large set where many of them are interactive. So the question is, are metaphors like document and pages still useful today? And how do having these mental models and metaphors help us deliver digital content? All of this takes me to my guest for this episode, Brad Frost. Brad is a web designer and engineer, and he has been thinking about these questions for some time, the result of which is a design pattern which he calls atomic design. In fact, he wrote a book about it with the same title. And if I piqued your curiosity and you want to find out what atomic design is all about, well, let me hand over to my conversation with Brad, who I met towards the end of 2024.
I'm Brad Frost, and I am a web designer and developer, design system consultant. I basically make web stuff and help others do the same. Speaker, writer, consultant, and I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I work at a place called Big Medium, which is an agency where we work with organizations of all shapes and sizes, helping them design at scale and help designers and developers and stuff work better together and make good things together.
Indeed, and you're also the author of a book called Atomic Design.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you about that. But before we start, let's talk a little bit about the history of web design and web development. Because when we think of web and web apps, we actually think of pages, don't we?
Yeah.
We think of pages as in a book. And I think it's a great metaphor because it's something we kind of instantly recognize. And we still talk, I'm going to this and that web page. So do you see there's a limit in this kind of metaphor and this kind of approach of looking at web applications as pages?
For sure. And the historical context really matters, you know, the birth of the web and how it all came to be with CERN and all of these kind of scientific papers. That was really the impetus to create this thing, was to connect all of these documents, right? These pages that historically lived in a different format, and to sort of bring those together and to link them together, right? So that page metaphor was really woven into the bedrock of the web as a medium, and it does, and it persists today. If a web page fails to load, it will say this web page failed to load. So while that's our experience and continues to be our experience, right? Whenever we navigate to any page on the web, we are experiencing it as this kind of whole. But as time has gone on, as the web progressed, and whenever we think about how we construct the web, I kind of entered into it whenever the limitations of the page metaphor, whenever responsive web design came on the scene as the explosion of smartphones and then tablets and things like that
Mm.
enter the scene. It was like, well, how do we make this homepage responsive and scale and flex to fit
Right.
all of these different viewport sizes? And as we sort of dug into those problems, it was like, well, it's not the whole page that's hard. It's the header, or it's this data table, or it's this kind of navigation pattern. It's not
Mm.
the entirety of the page, but rather sort of component pieces of that page. So that's kind of where I entered into thinking about things in more of a
Mm.
component driven page, where it's all of these sort of smaller pieces that are all kind of coming together and being composed together to create a full experience.
And that takes us also to the definition of document. Still in HTML, we talk about HTML documents. But as you say, so the challenge today is to actually deliver content. So let's call it that. So let's abstract it out from page
Sure.
document to content.
Yep.
We deliver content to actually multiple different hardware devices, right?
Hmm.
So from a web page here I said it again, a web thing to a web browser on your computer, but also on a smartphone and a tablet, and
Yep.
maybe even on a watch or something like
Yep.
that, or maybe future in glasses. So what are the challenges then to deliver all that content to all these different devices?
Yeah, there's a number of different ways to think about it, look at it. One is through the lens of the web as a medium and content being delivered through a
Mm.
browser of sorts, whether that's through a smartphone browser, an embedded browser within an app inside of Facebook or
Yeah.
whatever, something like that. So that brings with it all the responsive challenges of like, how do you create an adaptive user experience
Mm.
and user interface that's able to sort of scale and squish from, teeny tiny things like a watch whenever those first hit the scenes. It was really fascinating. You can, here's a tweet that popped up on my smartwatch. You tap on the link and it takes you to a web page.
Mm.
And it's like, you can create these kinds of experiences, which is really fascinating. So that brings with it this attitude of there's not really one fixed device class that we have in mind when we're designing and
Mm.
building. We really have to sort of design and build for this entire resolution spectrum and device classes that consider devices that haven't yet been conceived. So that's like a really fundamental shift in how we
Mm.
create things, going from, yes, I'm designing this thing that's meant to be delivered on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, or a brochure that has these dimensions, or a book that has these dimensions, all the way to here's this totally fluid and flexible medium that doesn't really have upper or lower bounds. So that's one lens of looking at it specifically through the web. But then
Yeah.
as you're decoupling, saying content delivery, that gets into even more of abstraction, because you can have all manner of different output touch points, I guess you could call them, right? So things like native applications that aren't built using web technology. You have
Mm.
things like kiosks. We've worked with organizations that, like NASDAQ, their content is going to a ticker in Times Square in New York City. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
what you're really talking about is really the challenges around creating clean, structured content that's able to be delivered anywhere, irrespective of kind of what technology or what touch point it is. It's just like, how do you arrange, assemble, and organize your content in
Mm.
such a way that it's able to go anywhere it needs to and be assembled in any combination, which is fascinating. And that kind of transcends just like the web and
Yes.
more into just like structured content and content design and strategy.
And I think that's a very nice segue into atomic design, because we're moving away from this rather monolithic, if I may put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
view of a web page and document, which was suitable for the time it was created in the late 1980s at CERN, and for scientific communication initially. But we moved on since then. So could you explain to us what atomic design is and what it brings to the table.
Yeah. So what atomic design is really a mental model for thinking about user interface. And what it does is you could break down any user interface, right? The one that we're looking at right now to have this conversation, any website, any native application, your bank's ATM, or just really any piece of software, any user interface. If you were to explode those user interfaces, you would be left with these basic building blocks similar to the natural world, right? All matter in the known universe can be exploded and broken down into these basic building blocks, right? These atoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
The periodic table, carbon, iron, helium, hydrogen, and so on. And those atoms have their own properties, but they don't often exist on their own, right? It's only kind of through how they're assembled and arranged
Mm-hmm.
that they become more useful. So in the world of user interface, it's like you could explode, let's say, a web page into things like a label, an input, a button, an icon, a heading, and things like that. These are often just the raw HTML tags, effectively, of
Right.
an experience. Not terribly useful, though, on their own, right? They all embody their own properties and stuff, but it's only whenever they're combined together that they
Mm-hmm.
start to become more sort of functional, right? So that's what I did with atomic design. Was I sort of spelled out there's kind of 5 discrete stages, but they all happen concurrently. It's not like a sequential thing. It's just like atoms are the littlest bits. Those atoms combine to form relatively simple components that I call molecules. So like a text field component, for instance, might be comprised of a label atom, an input atom,
Mm.
and maybe some helper text, like a little like
A
kind of
tooltip or
paragraph, right?
something.
And so yeah, just that. Now all of a sudden we have these couple atoms orchestrated together that are now sort of doing a job, right? So now you have
Mm-hmm.
this relatively simple component, and then those relatively simple components get assembled into more complex components that I call organisms. And so that might be like a contact form, for instance, right? That's comprised of a name input field, an
Mm.
email input field, and a message text area, and then a submit button, for instance, right? So that all of a sudden embodies its own qualities and has its own increasingly complex moving parts. And then from there, then we break the metaphor and go into what I call templates, which are basically you sort of take all of these atoms, molecules, organisms, and then arrange them into an
Mm.
actual layout. But at the template level, what you're really focusing on is just the skeletal system or the
Mm-hmm.
structure of a template. And then at the page level is the kind of 5th and most complete stage of this, which is where you pour real content, real application state into
Mm.
a template, right? So here's the home page template with this specific image applied to it, with this specific headline applied to it, with this specific call to action and stuff like that. And so that page stage is what we all experience as users of software, as users of a user interface. Is like we see the user interface, we see it populated with whatever content it is. We log into our bank and
Yeah.
we see the dashboard and we see here's the table of our recent transactions. There might be some data visualizations and things like that. And that obviously that content is going to differ from user to user, right? If you've been with your bank for several decades, you're going to have a much different experience than a person that's just logged in for the very first time. They just signed up for the bank. So what is nice about this methodology is what it does is it kind of creates a connective tissue between these underlying component systems that help
Mm.
power all of our product experiences, right? The things that we're actually building, and kind of creates this virtuous cycle where the components all the way at like the atomic end, we're sort of stressing over the details and the border radius of a checkbox, but
Mm.
we're able to sort of step through how those little decisions ultimately manifest in real products that real humans use, right? So it creates this connective tissue between what we call design systems, these kind of component
Yeah.
UI design systems, and the products that those systems build. And you have this virtuous cycle where the components inform and influence what can be built with them, but what's built with them also informs and influences what's in the system.
All right, so there is a technical level, if you like. So it's the labels and perhaps even the organisms or the molecules, because you have to put them together in code or whatever.
Yep.
And then you have the product level, which is a much higher level, where you put it all together, which is a statement about what the whole thing does, but not at all, but not only focusing on the technical levels. So we're kind of marrying the product management side with the development side. Is that what it aims for?
When we get down to it, it's like, well, anyone who's responsible for creating a digital product is impacted by this. In order to create the whole, we have to create the parts of the whole. And I think that what atomic design has done is provided a way to think about and structure the parts of the whole and organize them in a way that seems sort of like sane and achievable. Similar to the physical world manufacturing process, right? You have a car, you have a bunch of people involved in the manufacture, the design and building of a car. And then there's all sorts of components that go into creating a car. And they all, of course, come together into this finished thing that does a job for other people. So there's a lot of commonality between these processes and what we see in other realms.
I think there's quite a lot in there that I would like to pick apart a little bit. One of which is the breaking of the pattern. So you have the atoms, you have the molecules, you have the organisms, but then you have the templates and the page. Was the decision to break with these metaphors because we are familiar with pages and templates?
Yes.
Right? So giving that up.
People already thought I was crazy with just kind of introducing those other terms. So it's like I had to kind of bring it back into a world that felt familiar. All of this was kind of born from real client projects that we were working on. So we were on the hook to deliver pages and templates and stuff in order to do our job. So that's kind of why, of course, now since received many, many years of people, fixing my language or extending it or saying, what about ecosystems and what about, all sorts of things.
Not ecosystems.
Super structured. Yeah, all sorts of things. But that's really it. Because at the time when I created this in 2013, at the time, components were becoming more of a concept, right? It was becoming more of like okay, we have these discrete building blocks, but it was kind of coarse. It was just like, here's this idea of components and you could build things out of that. And I said, well, yes, but also it's not as maybe nuanced as it could be. And so what I was trying to do was really to put a finer point on, well, what exactly is a component? And there's actually these various levels of complexity. And so I was just trying to sort of establish some language that kind of helped articulate this. Little things are included in bigger things, which are included in even bigger things, which ultimately carry on until you have a whole experience.
It's 11 years old, then, atomic design.
It's pretty wild. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how do people actually go about implementing it? Let's look at it from a technical side.
Sure.
I think we're all familiar with labels and text fields, paragraphs, and all the other basic components that you call atoms.
Yep.
But how do I go from there to, say, creating molecules and then organisms, to stay with the language, with the metaphors?
Sure.
And what kind of technical solutions do people have available? Because on the web, there are really thousands of different frameworks. Well, I'm exaggerating a little bit.
No, I don't know if you are exaggerating. I think that is true. I think that there might be, when you talk about which ones are popular or sort of above the waterline, it's still a healthy number of them.
Indeed.
So basically, from a technical perspective, for what it's worth, just like this language doesn't necessarily find its way into our code bases necessarily. Again, it's more like kind of an overarching mental model that guides how we're creating things and architecting things. Some people, and we've worked with many organizations who do indeed organize them by atoms, molecules, organisms, and they organize their design files and Figma files and things like that in a similar way. And if that works for people, great. But I'm always sort of quick to say, it's like, you don't need to formally or explicitly call these things or label these things as such in order to practice atomic design. It's more a mental model. It's more of a kind of like a philosophy than it is use these exact labels and structure them and organize things in this way. But coming back to the question is like, how do we take all these HTML bits and assemble them into these useful components? And there's all sorts of different technologies that are out there to do that. Tools like React, Angular, Vue, Svelte. There's all of these different kind of JavaScript frameworks that have entered the scene. Even pre all of that, there were other component frameworks and stuff that were out there to sort of help basically cluster and deliver. Here's this thing, and we're calling it a text field. And under the hood is a label, an input, and some helper text or whatever. But that becomes the delivery vehicle for these atoms, molecules, and organisms. As we have these frameworks, increasingly we've been building design systems using technology called web components, which is like the native web technology that helps deliver those things in that way without necessarily having to sort of install a proprietary JavaScript framework. These ideas have found their way into the fabric of the web, into the technology of the web. And with web components, one of the biggest and most attractive parts of that is that they're interoperable because they're part of the web. They can go into a React application. They could go into an Angular application. They could go into a Vue application, a WordPress site. It doesn't really anywhere the web can go. These web components can go there. And when we talk about why we're doing that, like why we're creating these design systems in the first place, is what we're trying to do is deliver a consistent and cohesive experience to the users of our software, right? You go to a website, you're looking to buy a pair of shoes, you end up on the homepage, and you go through the whole user journey of, well, I'm going to click on the category page. I'm going to find a pair of shoes that I like. I'm going to add them to my cart. I'm going to check out, and so on. That oftentimes, especially at like large organizations, there might be like 4 different teams or more touching that experience. We encounter teams that are like, here's the homepage team, here's the product category team, here's the product detail page team, here's the checkout team. And the bigger the organization, the more sort of siloed there are, which is also the more opportunity for teams to be disconnected and ultimately end up reinventing the wheel. So with design systems, what we're sort of aiming to do is to say, here's a common system of components that contains all of the sort of basic ingredients that you need to create product experiences. And you reach for these things, and they have the brand best practices, the visual design, the UX best practices, the front end best practices, all kind of baked into them. And so you could just reach for them and trust that you're going to get these best practices for free. And then you can free your time up to do all the important things to make this application real. Building the thing rather than sweating over, oh, do I have that right hex color for the button, for instance, right? Like that's not a good use of a talented designer developer's time when there's more product level decisions to be made. So anyways, bringing this all back to like kind of web components, what's nice about this is that sometimes the homepage, the checkout experience, and everything in between might actually be built using different technologies. But from a user experience perspective, what we want to do is deliver this consistent experience across the board. And before web components, it was like you would have to kind of reinvent these UI components for each and every technology that you were employing at an organization.
I think you're touching on a very important point there. I also experienced the same thing, that you have organizations where you have different teams working on different parts of a web application. As a user or as a consumer, we think of it as a big blob of web pages, but actually there are different teams and sometimes complex organizational structures behind them. So atomic design then also touches on the workflow, on how the work progresses from conception to realization and delivery. And do you have anything to say how best to do that in terms of how you realize an application? What kind of workflow practices you would recommend that would help atomic design development?
We'll say I'll draw a boundary around it in saying that it's like atomic design is these 5 stages that I described earlier, all working together. And like the world that's been built around it is this world of design systems. There's the assets, but also you're talking about the sort of people and process and the orchestration of all of these things together to build things, right? And that's been the bulk of our work over the last 11 years, helping organizations establish and build these design systems, but also how to successfully implement them at organizations where, there's many different teams. There's a lot of, we'll say, an uneven level of knowledge and skill and whatever kind of around all of this stuff. So much of this has to do with like helping people realize and wield design systems in order to build great digital products. So what this means from what you're asking is like we're creating a brand new product within our organization, or we're redesigning this old legacy application. It doesn't matter, right? We're at a point where we're trying to realize something, we're trying to define what it is, and ultimately we need to create it. Just the normal product design and development cycle. What gets interesting when you have a design system at an organization, those become materials by which to expedite a lot of that work, right? So it's like once you have a lot of your Lego bricks, you can get into the game of assembling them, which means you can move a lot faster and get further down the line into something that resembles more of like a working piece of software a lot faster than if you are having to create everything from scratch. It's slower going. And so what's fascinating, and this is something that we feel strongly about and we help teams kind of work on, is that there's this historic and I'll say fundamentally busted design process, which is like, first we do this, we create these big formal wireframes, then we go into Figma and we sweat all the details and get all like the layout just right. And we do that for a desktop size screen, a tablet size screen, and a mobile size screen. And then we go through rounds of review, we get approval on that. And then eventually we like hand it over to the developers to build out. And there's a lot of waste in that process. It assumes a bunch of things, and it also gets into like, well, these artifacts, which are ultimately abstractions of the real software product, right? We spend a lot of time creating pictures of websites instead of actually making websites. So what's fascinating is that when you have a design system in place, and this has become like way more pronounced in a lot of the work that we've been doing, is like the kind of intersection of this new generation of generative AI tooling plus design systems, is that you can go from, we need this homepage to do this, we need it to include this, we need it to do these jobs, we need it to sort of like say these things. And you can go from a prompt, a whiteboard sketch, a napkin sketch into pretty sturdy working software built using the design system's ingredients in a matter of seconds. So what that does is that like radically transforms what the design process looks like, going from that idea stage through implementation that was historically this, like, again, sort of big, long and waterfall process. And now we're at a point where once you have the ingredients, these kind of sturdy UI ingredients in the form of a design system, you could then do all sorts of things and create all sorts of products out of those experiences.
I mean, at some stage, you need to build these tiny little ingredients, or you need to copy them from somewhere.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think the nice thing about this approach is when we're designing, we're also building at the same time. We're not having just a wireframe. We're actually having a real button, or we're having a real text field. And then we put that aside and build a library that way. And maybe we can use it at a later stage, even if we're not going to use it now. Is that what you're saying?
You're right in saying that the construction of these little pieces is necessary, right?
Mm.
And you can do that, again, sort of back to atomic design, you could do that concurrently. And this is kind of what we work with our clients on. We encounter a lot of teams that are doing this where they're like, okay, everyone, time out for several months. We need you to sit on your hands because we need to go over here and assemble all of these little buttons and form fields and alert components. And then eventually we can kind of pick back up and start plugging them in, which is not the approach that we recommend. In the spirit of atomic design, it's like this is a concurrent process. You can simultaneously create real products and the parts of the whole, right? The underlying sort of system at the same time. And that's what we've seen to be really successful, right? So by way of creating, building, and shipping real product experiences, we're also building up our toolkit of reusable user interface components, which as time goes on, that toolkit, just like if you think about the tools you have in your flat or, or wherever you live, you have a hammer, you have screwdrivers, you have, wrenches, and we arrive at those tools in our toolkit by way of real projects that we need them for, right? If you don't have something in your toolkit, you need to exert the time, energy, money to go to the hardware store, acquire the tool, do the job. But then whenever you're done with it, you don't discard it, right? You put it with its friends in the toolkit. And over time, those toolkits become more mature, more comprehensive, and you have what you need to address nearly any issue you might have around your house. It's kind of in that spirit with user interface design systems that, yes, it takes a little bit of time to get that kind of center of gravity going and to sort of get that robust toolkit in place. But the interesting thing for me has been once you have that in place, what are you going to do with it? For the last number of years, we've seen a lot of design system teams that have been established kind of go inwards and focus on building out those kind of smaller bits and doing that. And don't get me wrong, that's like really important. It's this important infrastructure that makes all this other stuff possible. But at the end of the day, like we don't necessarily want to be in that inward facing phase forever. What we want to be doing is really focused on making great user experiences out of the design system. That's kind of where we as like an industry need to get to faster. We need to be really outward facing and sort of saying, hey, for the rest of the organization, what are you doing? What are you building? What are you trying to get out the door? And we have all of these great tools. We have all this great infrastructure to help you do that work successfully and do that work quicker as well.
I think a lot of the listeners here of this podcast will be researchers, but they also do a lot of websites and web applications, sometimes very complex ones. I quite appreciate the story about we're building the toolbox, we're blocking everybody's time for 6 months and then miraculously come back to the product that we're actually selling,
Yeah.
which of course is never what's going to happen. And at least I worked in the private sector long enough not to have experienced any like that. You always compromise, right?
Sure.
We do a little bit here, we do a little bit there. So I think this is why this concurrent improvement basically is so important, that you start with it right from scratch.
Yeah.
And when we talk about building this inventory of tools, you would have to do that anyway, whether you do waterfall or not. I mean, so this is the time you have to spend. So it's not kind of, oh, we only have to do this if we do atomic design.
Yeah, I think that, and that's like, I'm always quick to point out that it's like from a production perspective, it's not infinitely more time to do it in this way. So much of it just has to do with just a shift in mentality. In order to create the whole, we need to create the parts of the whole. And all we're doing is just kind of giving a little bit more thought to how we are constructing the parts of the whole, to just think about how might these be reused in the future, right? That's almost just the little exercise. We use like the old environmental phrase, think globally, act locally. We're kind of considering, well, how might this thing that I'm working on, that I'm building, be used maybe in the future? And that's just a good little quick thought experiment. We see a lot of teams boil the ocean. Oh, yes, we need to factor in and contemplate every potential outcome and edge case that this might have, and we need to craft the perfect button. And we're saying, no, you don't have to do this, right? What's so great about building through real stuff is that you're able to say, we can consider this other stuff, but what we're looking at in front of us is we need this. We need this button to do this job. And yes, we need to make sure that we don't paint ourselves into a corner, and we need to be sort of accounting for and thinking about contemplating other use cases for this. But let's not paralyze ourselves. Let's be pragmatic with this, right? We could do the task in front of us, design, build, ship the thing in front of us, while also setting the stage for this thing to be touched again and improved and extended in the future.
Accepting the fact that something will have to change in future anyway, because in software it always does.
That's it. That's it. In the same way that it's just, oh yeah, I need some new bits for my drill, or I need to add this new thing. There's, well, can we get away with extending our current tools? Do we need to invest in or create another tool? But it really does boil down to like, yeah, you're not going to accommodate every use case. And I'm sure like your audience that's like more sort of like researchers and stuff encounters this a lot, right? Where it's like our horizons are only so visible to us, and that we can get into these very esoteric or theoretical discussions and devolve into paralysis of like, well, what ifs and whatever. And that just ends up harming us in the long run. It's like what we see is establishing like a really solid practice of iteration, improvement, measurement, just that feedback loop of let's do some stuff, let's ship some stuff, let's learn some stuff, let's integrate what we learned into the thing, and just lather, rinse, repeat, and get good sort of traction. And that's what we work with organizations on doing, because what they'll try to do is instead this kind of big, okay, yeah, we're going to like do all of this and then we'll roll it out all at once. And we haven't seen that be successful for a lot of places.
I think that holds for software engineering in general, not just for web development, I guess. We're coming to the end now. So you end your book with "Go forth and be atomic," which is a nice call. I like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so how has the reception been then? Have people gone atomic?
I think so. I mean, one of the fascinating things with this, what it did was created a shorthand, a buzzword for lack of for better and for worse, right? And I've seen it in all sorts of like weird contexts and slides and misused and abused and things like that. But ultimately, I think one of the things that I can say with confidence is that it did help provide people with a succinct shorthand to describe this system-minded, this component-driven design and development process that often takes more words to properly express, but to sort of encapsulate it into short words, I feel like has been helpful for people, where they're able to sort of say, atomic design, here's a picture of like what that looks like, and people are able to say, oh, I get it. So I'm proud of that fact, because I think that a number of people have taken it. They've let me know that it's helped them sell these ideas through to people that don't necessarily, that aren't in the weeds of this stuff, but they're able to sort of say, oh yeah, okay, like I understand why. So yeah, I think people have become atomic, and and that buzzword has had some value for people. It's been a wild ride for sure. So
I'm sure it has been. So
yeah.
How did it change your own work then?
Frankly, I mean, how we've been doing this since its inception, I'll get asked a lot of times is like, what would you change with it? And honestly, as time goes on, how we've been practicing it continues to be relevant, and maybe even more so relevant, because what we've seen now that design systems have become a thing, like it's an actual practice, there are dedicated teams to it, there's resources and money kind of allocated to it. What that's done is I've seen it create the separation between the people working on the atoms and the molecules and the organisms and like those sort of smaller pieces, and the products that those things build. So there's been this distance that's emerged across the entire industry. People like me have been saying, hey, design systems are important. We should be funding them. We should be resourcing them. We're kind of like a victim of our own success in a way, but it's created this distance between the underlying design system and the products that it serves. So all these years later, the sort of practice of atomic design of getting these things closer together and really truly connecting them and having them be concurrent and having them be kind of one and the same maybe is even more relevant now that there's been this drift in distance that's emerged. So I see atomic design as a way to kind of
glue it together,
glue it back together a little bit. Yeah.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Brad.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And I wish you all the best for atomic design, and go atomic, go long.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Peter. This is great. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
What Brad mentioned during our chat, the fact that we can build tools we need for a job or for a project we're working on right now, but also think about how we can reuse them in future, I think that's a lesson that doesn't only apply to user interfaces or user experience design. It obviously applies to software development in general. As he said, work locally, think globally. Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and if you're interested in the concept of atomic design, and of course you are, I encourage you to take a look at the link for the book, which you can access for free. I also like to thank Brad for his gracious time and patience. And if you're a designer, engineer, or want to become one, let's take Brad's parting shot from the book to heart. Go atomic. Okay, that's it for now, and I hope you tune in for the next episode in 2 weeks, while I'll be talking to the creators and maintainers of a tool in linguistics, a tool called Pandog. And I hope to see you then. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.